Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jenna Weens, and this is work done in collaboration with my colleagues Guha Balakrishnan and Joel Brooks, and my advisor, Professor John Gutte. And we are all members of the Data-Driven Medicine Group in the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT. So to crash or not to crash? That is the question, at least for the next 20 minutes or so. So you might be thinking, if you've only read the title and you haven't gotten a chance to read the paper or the abstract, crash, as in crash the net in hockey. Or you might be thinking crash, as in a NASCAR crash. But this talk isn't about NASCAR racing, and it's not about hockey. This is a quantitative look at the relationship between offensive rebounding and transition defense in the NBA. So without further ado, let's get to why you're here. A shot's released. What should the offensive teammates do? So here we have Chris Humphries, number 43, releasing a jump shot, and 3 of his teammates with giant white question marks over their heads, wondering, should I crash the boards and go for the offensive rebound, or should I start getting back on D? And to answer this question, there are essentially 2 philosophies in the NBA that are depicted here by these 2 basketballs. The picture on the left is inspired by the great American general George S. Patton, when in doubt, attack. Well, the second philosophy is alluded to by the first Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. And he said, a great general should know when to retreat and to dare to do it. So which philosophy is better or more correct? Well, of course, the truth, like most things in life, lies somewhere in the middle. There are many specific factors that could influence a team's decision to crash or retreat, such as personnel, game situation, or even officials. But we believe that there's still merit to even the most general case, to analyzing even the most general case. And our work is about really laying the groundwork for future, more in-depth analysis. So between the time a shot is released and just before the ball hits the rim, players have a choice. They can either crash, go for the offensive rebound, or retreat, get back and get ready to defend. Of course, there's a third choice. They could do nothing and hope that the ball goes in. So before we can quantify the trade-off between crashing and retreating, we need to measure crashing and retreating. So the first thing we did was we looked at, well, how are crashing and retreating currently measured in the NBA? And they aren't. Well, to be fair, there are offensive rebounds and transition points allowed that capture some elements of this trade-off. But really, these box score statistics are just inefficient or insufficient for the type of analysis that we want to do. They offer no insight as to why a team is getting more offensive rebounds than others, or why a team is allowing more transition points. So to answer these types of questions, we use data from Stats LLC, their SportView system, which is currently installed in 15 NBA arenas. And it continuously records the entire game. And then all of this video is processed by Stats. And they extract the X and Y coordinates of all players and the X and Y and Z coordinate of the ball. Now, I should mention, we also have data on the officials, but we dare not touch that out of mortal fear of invoking the wrath of the commissioner's office. So all of this play data, or all of this position data, is then augmented by play-by-play data by Stats. So we know who took the shot, when a substitution is made, or when a foul is called. So it's a really rich data set. And using this data set, and specifically the positions of the players, we consider where players are when a shot's released and where they go immediately after, just until the ball is rebounded. And our data set consisted of 233 games from the 2011 to 2012 NBA season. And within that data, we consider all missed jump shots. So we define jump shots as a shot taken at least 15 feet from the basket. And the reason we limit ourselves to jump shots is because we want to make sure that players have not only enough time to make a choice, but also enough time to act on that choice. And really, rebounding layups is a whole other ballgame. So once we had these criteria, we had over 6,000 missed jump shots in our data set that were taken at least 15 feet from the basket. And the average reaction time, so the time between when a shot's released and when the ball was rebounded, was about 2.2 seconds. So within that time, players have a choice. They can either crash the boards or start getting back on defense. And to measure what players are doing, we started with the simple definition of if a player moves towards the basket during this time, they're considered to be crashing. And if a player is moving away from the basket during this time, they're retreating. But as you probably guessed already, these definitions are too simplistic. There are many cases, as in the case shown here, where a player might actually move away from the basket to gain better position to get the rebound. So we have Magic boxing out Larry Bird in this picture, and you can see he really is moving away to get the rebound. So the previous definitions were too simple. So based on this logic and our data, we split the court into 3 zones. The inside zone, anywhere within 8 feet of the basket. The neutral zone, between 8 and 33 feet of the basket. And the outside zone, anyone outside 33 feet of the basket. And using these zones, we define 4 counts, which I'm going to explain now. The PI count, which is the number of players in the inside zone. And this is simply the count of players and the number of players in the inside zone when the shot is released. We also have the PO count, which is the number of players in the outside zone when the shot's released. Then it gets slightly more interesting in the neutral zone, so between 8 and 33 feet. All players who are in the neutral zone at the time the shot's released and who crash move at least 5 feet towards the basket, contribute to our count of number of neutral players who crash. And similarly, we define an NPR, the number of neutral zone players who retreat or move at least 5 feet away from the basket. So using these 4 counts, we define our crash index and our retreat index. So the crash index is just a sum of the number of players inside and the number of neutral players who crash. So it's trying to capture how many players are trying to go for the rebound. And retreat index is the sum of the number of players outside and the number of neutral players who retreat. So there we're trying to capture how many players are getting back on defense or are already back on D. Oh, and I should mention that both of these values can vary from 0 to 5. So our crash index and retreat index could both be 0 if all players in the neutral zone don't move or move less than 5 feet in any direction. So they need not necessarily sum to 5 either. So I want to go through an example just quickly to make sure we're all on the same page. Here we have the position of the offense at the time of a shot and their positions immediately following the shot just before the rebound's secured. And we see that we have a PI, the number of players inside, of 1, and number of neutral players who crash, also equal to 1. A PO, number of players outside, equal to 0, since we don't have any players outside of 33 feet at the time the shot's released. And an NPR, number of neutral players who retreat, is equal to 3. 3 of our players in between 8 and 33 feet move at least 5 feet away from the basket. So our crash index is 2, and our retreat index is 3. So we measured the crash and retreat indices for every missed jump shot in our data set, so over 6,000 jump shots. And we looked at how the crash and retreat indices related to offensive rebound rate. So this heat map On the y-axis, I have the crash index, which is varying from 0 to 3, and retreat index, which is varying from 0 to 4. And the colors represent offensive rebounding rate. So the first thing to notice is the upper left-hand corner. Send 3 players to crash and 0 players to retreat. Result in an offensive rebounding rate of 40%, way higher than average. The other thing to notice is that as we increase our crash index, the offensive rebounding rate increases, which is probably not very surprising. But what is perhaps more surprising is that if we hold the crash index constant, so let's pick 2, and we move along the x-axis, and we increase retreat index, the offensive rebound rate actually goes down, even though we're sending the same number of players to crash. Now, I want to stress that what I'm showing here is an association and does not necessarily imply causation, and I'll come back to that later. So we looked at the crash index and retreat index for all 6,000 missed jump shots in our data, and then we aggregated across teams. And here we're showing data for 8 teams for which we had at least 200 missed jump shots that met our criteria. And on the y-axis, we're showing the percentage of time that that team sent more players to crash than retreat. So Houston is sending more players to crash than retreat about 40% of the time, whereas someone like Golden State is doing so far less often. So we do, in fact, see that different teams have different philosophies, or rather, I should say had, since this is data from the 2011-2012 season. The other thing to notice is that the data show that more often than not, teams are sending more players to retreat than to crash, despite the fact that sending more players to crash might get you the offensive rebound. So why are teams doing this? What are teams gaining by getting back on D? Well, to answer this question, we considered a subset of our missed shots that resulted in a defensive rebound, so approximately 75%. And we considered the outcome of the ensuing possession. So you just missed your shot, the other team gets the rebound, they can either score or not. We binarize the outcome. And we found that possessions where at least 2 players were sent retreating had 4 times the odds of preventing a transition score compared to possessions where fewer than 2 players were sent retreating. And I should note the use of the word transition here. RI did not have any measurable effect on outcome for possessions longer than 4 seconds in length. So I've talked a little bit about what you can gain from getting from crashing, the offensive rebound. And I've talked about what one gains from getting back on defense, preventing the transition score. And we can combine these 2 things to calculate the net gain on a missed jump shot. And we calculate that as the probability of getting the offensive rebound multiplied by the expected number of points you'd score. Subtract the probability of the other team getting the rebound multiplied by how many points we expect them to score. And we can break down the net gain by retreat index and crash index to see how it varies. And notice that all of these numbers are negative. So missing a shot is never a good thing. The second thing to notice is that as we increase the crash index, the net gain goes up. And as we increase the retreat index, the net gain goes down. So if we just focus on the diagonal, let's say we're sending 2 players to retreat and 1 to crash versus 2 players to crash and 1 to retreat. If we were to always be in the left-hand corner and then all of a sudden we swapped our philosophy and we switched to the right-hand corner, we could expect a gain per missed jump shot of about 0.17 points. Now, that doesn't sound like much. But if you consider over the course of a game how many missed jump shots there are, let's say 25, this could result in more than 4 points over the course of a game. Whoops. So swapping the role of a single player from retreat to crash can result in approximately 4 points per game. And we all know that there are many basketball games that are closer than 4 points. So there are a couple of caveats to this analysis. The first being that I want to remind this is data across all teams. So we didn't account for personnel. And of course, depending on who you have on the floor, so whether it be Dennis Rodman, one of the greatest rebounders of all time, or John Stockton, one of the greatest defensive players of all time, or someone like a Smurf, not really known for their offensive rebounding rate or their defensive play, sending these three players to crash or retreat may have very different expected outcomes. And we did this as a general analysis over all the teams in the NBA, but you could see this being tailored for specific teams such that a team could optimize their crash and retreat index or find the optimal crash and retreat index to optimize their net gain. The second caveat is important in any statistical analysis, and that again, these numbers are associations, not causation. And while we hypothesize that sending more players to crash does in fact increase your probability of getting the offensive rebound, it could be the case that a player sees an opportunity to be had and then crashes. And it's really difficult to tease apart these two things, if not impossible. So I talked about the retreat index, which is what players are doing between the time that the shot's released and the time the rebound is secured. But we all know that there's much more to playing defense than just getting back. You need to be ready to neutralize threats. So we came up with a third metric, the maximum distance to early threats, or the max det, to measure a team's ability to neutralize threats in transition. And I won't get into the details here. This gives me an excuse to plug our paper and you an excuse to come and talk to us. So, in conclusion, if there are any NBA coaches out there who want to take advice from a 5'4" girl who once played high school basketball, my advice would be to crash the glass. So at this moment, I'd like to invite my co-authors up on stage to answer any of your questions. And if you have questions, if you could line up here so we don't have to run all over the place with the mic, that would be great. Thanks.
Hi. My question is, did you factor man-to-man versus zone?
Did we factor man-to-man? No, we didn't account for personnel or who else was on the court or the strategy. We just looked at the X and Y position of each player on the court.
With more NBA teams playing zone today, just what's your guess? Do you think your theory works better in man versus zone?
I don't know, since we didn't do the analysis. But.
So yeah, I guess it's tough to say without the analysis, but I suspect that crashing wouldn't be as useful with the zone, just because there's people who are supposed to be rebounding in the zone. Perhaps, but I guess it's tough to say.
I think the right answer is we don't know the answer. We haven't done the analysis, because my intuition is exactly the opposite of his.
Right, and this will be the last thing. The reason I say that is because you're always told that it's harder to rebound out of the zone versus man-to-man.
It's certainly visibly apparent in the data from college games, where teams who play zone are not as effective at blocking out. It's very hard in the NBA. There's much less data on that. And the NBA defenses are, as you know, very complicated these days, and sometimes even hard to characterize.
Do you have an idea about how big the player differences or how big the referee differences are between from the general numbers to what a coach could expect in a game-to-game basis?
We know that it varies, but that's all we can say. We haven't done the analysis to account for personnel yet.
Okay.
An interesting experiment will be at the end of this year, where we see the Rockets have completely turned over their personnel,
right.
Including their top rebounders leaving. whether, for example, they continue to crash the boards with the current personnel or whether it was an artifact of who they had last year.
Just as a fan of the Boston Celtics, one thing I notice is they don't really seem to be aggressive at all about offensive rebounding. And I wonder if you have any insights about the Celtics.
We'll let Jenna handle that.
So we didn't have enough data for the Celtics in this data set. We weren't able to get a number that we felt confident about. I can say that they had one of the lowest crash index to retreat index ratios in the league, but again, we didn't have enough data to really put it up there.
It might have been only data for a couple of games,
Yeah.
really, so it wasn't enough.
Right? They
The
hardly
data
ever
we did
do.
have was very consistent with what you observed.
I actually had a specific question on the one slide that we're showing the 4-point differential. On that one, you were showing that you're saying switching the role of one player. Is the assumption there that are you assuming that you'd have one retreating and then two crashing, or what was the assumption in terms of the numbers there?
Right, so we can go back to that. So this one?
Yeah.
So I was assuming you're in the bottom left-hand corner where you have two players retreating and one player crashing. And if you were to swap the role of one player, and now you have two players crashing and one retreating. But you don't necessarily have to swap the role of one player. You could tell one player to stand their ground and then another player to crash.
How large was that data set you're looking at for that particular slide?
For this particular side, so these are the four most probable scenarios in the NBA. I think that the total of those four boxes is about 1,000 data points.
Okay, thank you.
My question would be, how does like boxing out compare to just like crashing the boards? I mean, does it have any relevance in your study at all? Or, I mean...
So we didn't look at that, but I could imagine that that would be a really interesting study to take into account not only how many players are crashing, but also what the neutral players who stand their ground are doing. So they could be contributing to getting the offensive rebound, and we haven't really looked at that yet.
I knew you guys, or I know you guys only looked at NBA data, but I was wondering if you believe that your analysis would translate across all levels of play, including college basketball and high school even.
Well, a slight anecdote. So when the paper first appeared, I got an email almost instantly from somebody who pointed out that they coach a 9-year-old girls basketball team, and their shooting percentage is about 7%, and they decided they should crash the boards more. College, I think, is a very different kind of thing, because if you look at a Syracuse game and watch their zone, it's very different from, say, watching an Indiana game. We don't have the data, and this is work that we could never have done without the sports view data with all the XY coordinates, because there's no way to infer this from anything in the box score. So as far as I know, the data just does not exist for college to do this kind of analysis.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering if you looked at different game situations. For example, if your data was about, let's say, fourth quarter, you had some garbage time minutes versus a really close finish, 3 or 4 points, if there was any difference there.
So we definitely think that is one of the specific factors that would influence a team's decision to crash or retreat, but we didn't consider those factors in this initial analysis. But I could definitely see future analysis including that.
I was wondering if the expected points for, if you grab an offensive rebound, is for just the expected points per possession, or actually factors in that they have an offensive rebound, so the defense isn't set and they're probably in a better position to score.
Right, so it's the second. It definitely factors into the fact that they got the offensive rebound.
Does it matter where you crash from? If you're crashing from the baseline versus the top of the key, does that make a difference in terms of your expected points?
That's a good question. We didn't look at that.
We We should point out that last year was the first year they had this equipment in the NBA arenas. Most teams did not have it for a full season, so the amount of data is limited, which makes it hard to analyze special case scenarios. After this season, there'll be a lot more data to analyze, and you'll be able to look at questions where N just was not big enough in last year's data.
Great. Our last question.
I imagine that there are diminishing marginal returns on sending an incremental crasher. Any idea at what point the cost of crashing outweighs the kind of benefit of crashing?
So I think your question pertains to personnel.
No, so I'm wondering, like, if I have 4 crashers, the fourth crasher isn't going to give me as much benefit as the third crasher, but there's a greater probability of conceding the transition possession.
Right, so here we show only 4 scenarios, but you're right. The crash index varies from 0 to 5, and retreat index varies from 0 to 5. The problem is teams very rarely send 5 players to crash, so there just really wasn't enough data in these specific cases to measure any effect. So.
But the paper does contain more data than is shown in this chart.
Right. Thanks again, Jenna and her team.